Well, I want to start our study by looking at a verse out of Psalm chapter 14, verse 1. Very familiar text. Let's read that as we start. This verse tells us, as we begin the very chapter, that the fool is the one who says in his heart there is no God. Now, how many of you have heard of a man by the name of Stephen Hawking?
Stephen Hawking
Okay, some of you have heard of him. Let me tell you who he was. He is now dead. Stephen Hawking was probably, in the modern day, the most brilliant cosmologist that ever was.
Stephen Hawking
He also had expertise in what was called astrophysics. Stephen Hawking was known for his brilliance, but he was also known for the disease that he eventually took his life. Now, I can't pronounce the name of the disease, but it was known as Lou Gehrig's disease. It completely paralyzed him. He could not talk. He obviously could not walk. He could not do anything except sit in a chair. Now, most people who acquire that disease die rather early in life. But Hawking lived with it for years. He wrote a number of books. I actually have 2 of his books in my library. One of them was written in 2010, and it was called The Grand Design.
The Grand Design.
He eventually gave an interview actually he talked through a computer, but he gave an interview about that book. And in that interview, this is what he said. He said, one cannot prove that God does not exist. But he went on to say, but science makes God unnecessary. Now it's obvious who was God as far as Hawking was concerned, and it was science, his science. Now, I don't ever recall in all of the reading or what few lectures I heard by Stephen Hawking that he ever said that there is no God. But it is clear that that is something that he believed. He did declare himself an atheist. Now, he was a brilliant man. But as Psalm 14:1 tells us, he was a fool. So I guess you could call him a brilliant fool.
kami pilma mi hai siya pagkipay.
Now, as people of faith, obviously we believe that God exists.
Gin tu tian ka pathian om hi chi gin ta.
But we believe he exists because the evidence is overwhelming that he does in fact exist.
Aja ka pathian om chi thei na kha de na imu thei ding ngo. Evidence imu thei ding kel tam bi om zia ka hi.
And God has provided primarily two avenues of evidence by which we can look to see his existence.
Pathian om chi hong lak sa ding na thil ni a kha hong lak thei ya hi.
One of those is through what is referred to as the general revelation.
Khat na pen khai cha atang pia kelak na ho atang pia kelak na general revelation ke chama.
And I think that we are aware that what that's talking about is the physical creation around us.
When again pen tak chaya imu thei no thil te tum to na ka pathian om chi thei na pe nei.
Psalm 19:1 teaches us that the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork.
Bung som na kwat chang kan na ka bang tem pathian pe da na thei sa kwa tu kwa lian takin akut so kalam sa chi hi.
In Romans chapter 1 verse 20, Paul argues that the creation is telling us of God's existence, and everyone therefore is without excuse as far as understanding God being in existence.
Rom bung chang som ni na ka bang chen again ai che da ka khovel siam tunga ki pan apian ken mu thei lo tang ton chi thei na le apathian na thei siam na chiang ta ka mu thi ai china an again ai.
And so as we look at the physical creation, we can see that there is a God who is powerful and who has created all of this.
Ya ite na khil siam te tum to nai mu thei chu pathian au ma pathian pen khili thei na khili thei tak pathian ha tak ni hi chi ala hi.
But the physical creation does not tell us a great deal about the character of this God.
Ai hang na ho chu bang khil mu thei te na pathian hi na dik tak kha chiang takin hon hi thei hi.
And that's where his special revelation enters into the picture.
Bây giờ na special revelation pathian aku mo nga ama ke thei sak na akilak na imu hi.
And the special revelation is, of course, his revealed word, which we believe makes up the Bible.
Koi chu tu ni na nang le ke na Bible chi imu thei atho siam tho pe na hi akilak na dik tak kha.
And through the contents of the Bible, we learn about this magnificent, powerful God who created the universe.
Thế lại thành khẩu quan sân na ama pathian he le ban bol tu pa kha imu chia na hi.
And where that begins is in the book of beginnings.
Pa ta ko ke panian ke le lai bu ki pat na a hi.
It is, of course, the book of Genesis.
Pa chu Genesis ai.
Now, in the first lesson that I gave to you all, I emphasized the fact that the Genesis account is fundamental to the Christian faith.
Hey Genesis akayat pe ka Christian ke thogin bu keeping up na pe na hi.
It is described as a book of beginnings for a reason.
He ka chiu teng ki pat na bu hi na ja tam pio ma.
It tells us about the beginnings of all kinds of things, from the creation account to the relationship of the family, to the beginning of sin, to the beginning of a plan for God to solve the problem of sin.
Hoi chiu teng ki pat na chiu siam imu thei teng ki pat na ai ba na. Hoi ba na in kwan ki pat na le hiya. Hoi ba na khel na ki pat na le hiya. Hoi ba na khel na ki pan so tak thin ding ki pat na le ki mu hi.
And all of these beginnings are fundamental to the Christian faith.
Hoi de teng ka Christian te ading ina apoi mo ma ma ai.
Genesis chapters 1 through 3,
Genesis bung khat ki pan bung thum ka le na.
they become such a foundation to the faith of a child of God that without those chapters, we would have no reason to know why Jesus would have come into this world.
Hey Genesis bung khat pan bung thum ka apoi mo khel dan ka pathian ta te ading ina. Kei om dan kei siam lo ina kei lo pi na bang zia ka pathian ta hi na nei hi dia mo chi le kei lo ding he.
And so the book of Genesis is important, but Genesis chapters 1 through 3, and I would even go on to say chapters 1 through 11, are fundamental to the understanding of everything else that the Bible reveals.
Ka ba na bung khat pan bung thum chi ba na ka bung khat pan bung so le khat tan ka le tu ma khil teng Christian ni ding le poi mo kasai.
Now, today what I want to talk to you about is how the book of Genesis, the first 3 chapters in particular, tells us things about God that we need to understand.
He bung phata pan bung thun sumina pathian bang chibang pathian yam chi I thei siam thin di kha hon hi la hi.
And tomorrow we're going to talk about how the book of Genesis reveals things about us that we need to understand.
Kabana Genesis lai buina nang le ki kha mi bang chibang yam chi kha jing che gen di hi.
And then I'm going to wrap up my studies with you by looking at what is one of the most difficult texts in the entire biblical, all of the Bible.
Atop na digin na ilai sang thwa ki sia mak sa pen kim khat gen na to ut ka hi.
That is Romans chapter 5.
Achrom bung na na thoi.
And there is a Adam-Jesus contrast that is being made.
Adam le Jesu te kam na thua to ki sai.
And I look forward to covering that with you men as we look into that.
Wa kanu de to pe ta ka su khom ut ka hi.
But let's look at how or what Genesis tells us about God that we need to understand.
Genesis na pathian pen bang chibang pathian yam chi ien ding.
There are 5 things I want to suggest to you that we get from the first 3 chapters of Genesis about God.
Genesis bung khat apan bung thum sumina pathian hi na to ke sai nga mo ka ke en di hi.
The first one is this.
At na ya hi.
God is a powerful God.
Pathian chu thil hi thik tak hi.
Now, I have no English words to really embellish that, to make it even stronger, because I don't believe there's any language that can really help us understand how powerful this God is.
Pathian bang chi to ka hathiam bang chi to ka thili thiam chi ka again the sumal ka kapaw le da ki ka thei te hi.
To say that God is powerful is an understatement.
Pathian ka thili thei tak hi chi lerin kha hi athopi na gen khalo ai athopi na gen phazo lo hi.
And so we have to look at what God has done in order to be able to understand how powerful He truly is.
Bang chi to ka thupi hiam chi kha thili te kum to na pa na ke siam thei pa hi.
And from the first day of creation, we see the demonstration of the power of God.
Ani khat nia ke pa na pathian thili thei na pen kha ala kyak dani mo hi.
So let's read Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, and let's just read down through verse 5.
Bung khat sang kata ke pan sang mata ni sim diu la khatina
tu nin pathian len in le le van tia siam hi le tu lim le me nei loin awak tia hi a tui thu ki tung mial in mial hi pathian kha in tui te tung au tum hi pathian in ba om he na chi a hu chin ba ngom ta hi pathian in ba ka ena ho sa hi hu chin pathian mial a pan a kem ta hi pathian in ba su na chia mial sa na chi hi Puchin anikhan na ni taglama oma nam ni hi.
God spoke, and it came into existence.
pathian na ge na to chin hangom me hi.
And as we read the account of Genesis, or we read the account of creation in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 1, there are 8 simple commands of God that are revealed in this first chapter that are started out with the phrase, God said.
Genesis siam ai ke le thil siam tung tang hu ye cheng ina thil gyat pe tak kha om hem chi na kumara sang hi.
And by these 8 simple commands where God said, what that shows us is that God spoke all of reality into existence.
Hoi pathian na om hem cha thumal apau kyak pe kha hoi kha thil teng atak tak ung suak mok da hai.
Now, the phrase that is used to describe that is creation ex nihilo.
Hoi pen kha ex nihilo ke chi thumal ke zanga.
And it's a phrase that means God created everything out of nothing.
Hoi na jo bang ma om lo wa ke pa na thil hom bot hia chi thumal gen nai.
And He did this by His word,
Hoi kha athui na ge nai.
just by speaking.
Gen pama ap gen le hom me da nai.
You know, throughout the history of humanity, there has always been this problem of human beings turning away from the God who created them
he ko he kun pia mi dan kha amao bol to amao siam to ke pa dina pen mang tam pio yom zel hi.
Now, that doesn't mean that they turn away from worshiping something or someone. It just means they turned away from the God who created them, who they should be worshiping.
ผู้จะบังเงินอามาเกเป็นปัจจัยพกมองเลยปัจจัยดังเลยเบคาโลวินะอุจจาระปัจจัยในหลวงเดนุจินาฮิโซโลวินะอีกเลยอามาเสียงป้าปัจจัยตักอามังฮิโลจิทัวเฮ
And so when human beings turn away from God, they continue to worship perhaps false gods or maybe even themselves.
มีเดปัจจัยงานที่ปัจจัยนะอภัยสันอภัยมังเจ้ามันนะปัจจัยตักโลเบียวเฮียไอ้กิเลอามาเลยอามามาของกิเบมีมาเฮ
They put themselves in the very place of God.
ปัจจัยดิ้นมุนนะอามาเลยอามาอัตโกเฮ
And by the way, that was the sin of Adam and Eve.
ไว้ช่วยให้ต้องเลวีแข็งหนาค่ะ
I think John has more to say about that, so I'll leave that to him.
นับปัจจุบันในเกณฑ์เป็นตั้งปีในยิงกันตา
But it's interesting to note that when God's ancient people were always involved in idolatry,
เฮ้ยมินเรื่องลายมีเตเป็นมิลิมเบียกนาเขียนนาเกี่ยมกตาเฮ
the prophets who were sent to call them back to God
โซนในเตอามาปีกินนอนดิงาสอลังเตบังเล่
they always appealed to God's creative power.
อามาเตนค่ะปัจเจียนทีริเทคนาปัจเจียนทีริเซียมเทคนาค่ะเอาอเกนนาก็เห็น
Now, I just want to use one illustration that I think can help to show this point.
ไปเห็นจักรดิ่งนะแต่สักนาครับตรงเย็นดิ่งนะ
Turn to the book of Isaiah, the 40th chapter.
สายผมส้มลีนาถูเอ็นเล่ง
And in the context of this, what we are seeing here is a contrast between idols and God, and Isaiah is speaking about the greatness of the God that Israel should be worshiping.
แค่ค่ะปัจเจียนตักเล่มิลิมปัจเจียนเตปฏิบัติลงนาทูห้องเย็นนะอากุยเป็นว่าอีเบียกโจกที่อุจิกาฮอนเตกากันเห็น
So let's read first verse 12.
verse 1 to 12
Just verse
verse 12 verse 12 is in there กว่านะยาตุยเตอกุดเป็กสุงเลลอาเตอาตุงอาฟานขับเลลอาเตอาเลียเลวิเตนาขับเลลตัดทุนเบกาตางเตละขายามวลป้องเตอบุกนาเลลอาบุก
He is speaking about the creation, and he says that God holds it in the palm of his hand.
เพราะการเขียวเสียมทุกประเทศนั้นเลลบันค่ะอกุดเป็ก
And the reason why is because he is the creator of it.
บางเสียงยังไม่จิตอามาค่ะอาโบลตัวอิสราเอล
Let's look at verses 25 and 26 of this same chapter.
สมนิลนาและสมนิลกุศิมอินเดงกว่าตัวห้องเกียกว่ากินเกียห้องเสียงตะฮิวะมิเสียงพวินาจีเฮตุงละมันไม่ตัวหักคนละไว้ทิวเตปอเสียมาเฮียเอนุนอามันเสไปเตกิจอมจอมินอภิเฮียอามินเจตุนัสมาอาหารนาทุปีนาเจกเล็กทิลิเทนาอาหารเจกินขัดมาเลงกินละว่าอมนีกิวเฮ
Again, he is appealing to the creation as a demonstration of the true God.
ให้ละเชื่อเชื่อมเจ้าปัจเจียนเมละนาปัจเจียนทินาดีนะเห็นจะเห็นหน่อย
And let's look at verse 28.
จางส้มนี่เลยมาหน่อยสิมนองอยู่ส้มนี่เลยเดียดนั่งลงสิมุนนะที่เกี่ยวเฮียนับบิลุมนะจังเกี่ยวเฮียต่างคนปัจเจียนโตปะโกลมงเสียมปะอาบะลวะ
So what this is showing us, and this is just one example, is whenever the appeal was to the true God, it began with his creative efforts.
เพราะปัจเจียนตักตกที่ใช้ที่เย็นใช่ไหมนะอามันบางเฮียอาโบลจีอาปานี่นะอาทิตย์เสียมนะที่ปานี่นะปัจเจียนตักข้าสุดยักษ์ที่เย็น
Now the problem of idolatry is something that continues to plague human beings down to this very day.
เฮ้ยมิลิมเบียกนาต้องไปใส่ละอดีตโลอีกเทียมที่เย็นขัดเบลตอนที่ไม่สิเลย
It may be false gods that men have created out of their own will.
ปัจจัยตักโลอามินเอ็นะอามาแล้วมาอักเกบแค่ปุเล่ครับเพื่อน
Or it may be by men just putting themselves in the place of God.
ไอ้เกลอามาหมอมาเล่ปัจจัยดิ้นมุนานกินสักเล่คดีมั้ง
like Stephen Hawking and his allegiance to science.
Stephen Hawking le ama nung zui science nung zui e ma.
And what this does is it demonstrates nothing more than the pride and the arrogance of the human being.
Hoi te ka ming te kisak thek na le ming te lu na to kisai le hi pu te bang thiu te ka.
You may be familiar with this story I'm about to tell you. I know the Americans are because they've heard me say it throughout these past couple of weeks.
He ka sang na kang gen ni na unaw ken wel atik saw le ka dingai.
Let me see if this story will illustrate my point.
He tam kuin ka hong gen chang dia ma hong gen de.
There's a scientist who begins to have a conversation with God.
Scientist ka patyan ko ki holin ka wa.
He said to God, "We no longer need you, God, because we've developed a method by which we can create humans from dirt."
Aman patyan no nang kong koi mo mon kiu. Ko kaya le buya ke panina mi hin ka bo thei tao ko le chi.
He said, "Now that humans can create life from nothing, you are no longer necessary."
That's what the
This
scientist
is
said.
science said to God.
Hoi je ka kha ko le thil bang ma lo wa panina pu che bang min bo ke ta kai che mo na nang kong koi mo mon kiu a chi.
The story says that God was amused by this.
Hoi na patyan in kan wi sam la.
And so he asked the scientist if he would like to have a man-making competition.
Ai le patyan na aman ka mi hin bo ke dem ni o le a chi a.
And the rule was that whoever creates the finest human being from dirt will truly be superior.
Ho che na mi hin ahoi pen bo thei tu pen ka asyam pen di ole a chi wa.
So the scientist thought about it for a minute,
Ho che na scientist pan bang ta nyam ngai to a.
and then he nodded and he smugly said to God, "I accept your challenge."
Ho che na aman kha alua suwa che na ole e kong ngam hi a chia.
And so he stooped down and he gathered a handful of dirt.
Ho che na apuna aku di bina le wi la.
And God stopped him right there.
Pa ken ho ya kholi na chia.
And he said, "You have to create your own dirt."
Le wi nang le ke bo di na hi a chia.
And thus he showed the arrogance of humanity was something that was just driving him away from God.
Why da na hi ming te ka ama kisak te na zia ka ka pa ken na pan pial bang le yo.
If we are ever tempted to minimize or to marginalize God, to the being to whom we have committed ourselves, then we need to think about and meditate upon His creative power and what an all-powerful being God truly is.
Hoi ja ka ilung sing ngai to na te pa ken ko mang so ma ho che bang a pa ken na pan ke mang so mi ngi khak le ka. Ki che bang na pa ken thili thik na pa ken thil siam te a thupi dan te ngai to tha ke na pa ken lam ai ki di wei.
And Genesis tells us that by virtue of the fact that it says, "And God said, and it was done."
Genesis na ge na pa ken a chi chi ka thong piang ke me hi chi ka ge ni.
Now, the second thing I want to impress upon us is that Genesis tells us that God is transcendent. That is, He is outside of His creation.
Ai he ani na pen kha pa ken pen ka transcendent ki de chuma. Pa ken ki chi kha ama thil siam pola ma oma hi ama thil siam sunga om hiloina ama thil siam tok ki gam na pia oma hi la.
Now, in reading the creation account, it's clear that although God created the physical universe, He's not a part of the physical universe.
Pa ken he ko ver le la ban mu the bola ile wai la ka ama om hi pon lo hi wai la ka ama thil siam te la ka ama tel lo hi.
In the phrase, "In the beginning God created," is revealed the fact that God was before the beginning.
Hoi ja ka Genesis bong khan na kha atuming pa ken le ban asia ma chi cho le ban om ma pa ken among hi na hi ti ai.
He was before time began, and in fact, He is the creator of both time and the universe.
Hun ki pat ma le ama om a hi a hun ki chi le pa ken bol ma ana hi da nai.
And thus, being the creator of both, He is separate from it, as Isaiah said, holding it in the palm of his hand.
Ama kha akhil siam te tok ti bang hilo akhil siam te omma khil teng teng ama khut pe ko mai.
You know, back in ancient times, there were peoples who truly believed that the physical creation was part of God and God was a part of the physical creation.
Ni dang lai mi tam pi de na heya khil siam te kha lang kha pa thiam om de da na ngai koi na koi khil siam te ma kha pa thiam da na ngai ko pol le om da na he.
And there are people today who still believe this concept.
Hu che bang ngai dan na kha tu nia mi tam pi tan nei lai mo ko he.
I want to say this quietly, but Hinduism teaches that very concept. But what I will say loudly is that look at the climate movement. It's the very same thing in which they are worshiping the creation.
Climate movement.
The climate movement, the green movement. What do you want to call it? Environmentalist movement. Yeah, that's good.
Khovel khilote ma ya khovel kwa thak soma palang na tuam te pe thamo. Please repeat that.
Okay, it's the environmentalist movement. They want to how can I say it? They deify, they make the earth God, like Mother Earth.
Hetia le ba na khil le ba le tu ma khilom te ke bit soma pang la tu ten be le ma ama le kha pathian da na.
There are men meeting right now in Davos, Switzerland, who are dealing with this very thing, who worship the earth as if it was some kind of god. I could go on and on about that, but that's not the objective of this particular presentation. My point is that there are people who have this concept in the modern day that the world is nothing more than an extension of God and that everything in some sense is actually divine.
Just repeat it once again.
Okay, I'll just read what I have here in my notes. Okay, it is believed that through these movements that the world is an extension of God and therefore everything in some sense is divine, is deity.
Movement again. No, a great movement pen ha. Avoid ten ngai to dan chu. He khovel ki chi pen ha. To. Wa kha pathian to da na. Ngai to ina. Avoid ma kha buai pi de na om he. Pathian tak buai pi khalo ina. No.
The animals are a part of God. Trees are a part of God. The rocks are a part of God. This is known as pantheism, which is the belief that everything is God and God is everything. And pantheists do not believe in a personal God at all.
Personal God
But the Genesis account makes it perfectly clear that pantheism is wrong and that God is not a part of the creation. He is the creator, but he is separate from his creation.
Genesis in pantheism not kill siam paket hizen lo pathian akhil siam pe tok ki bang lo pe mai again.
Now that doesn't mean that he isn't concerned about his creation. And especially it doesn't mean that he's not concerned with what's going on this planet. Which brings me to my third point about God that is revealed in Genesis chapters 1 through 3. And that is that God is totally sovereign. He rules his creation and he takes care of it. Now, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it is clear that when God initially created, the creation was in chaos.
Genesis bung khat sang khat na kha pathena kilsiam tunga kha he de wan ke chi kha mumal nei lo taka mo I mga mumal nei lo taka asya awwa ka mahi.
And so in his creative work, what God did is he brought a chaotic universe into an organized existence.
Puchina hoy akisya awwa ka ompen aman hoy takina honglem hot takahi.
Let's read again Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to get this point.
Genesis bung khat sang khat na khai sim khat deu. Atungin pathenin leila van te asiam hi.
Let's read verse 2 also. It's really verse 2 that we need.
Leitu limle mer nei lowin avwak ya dia tui thuk pi tung mialina mial hi. Pathian khain tui te tung ok kum hi.
So God created, as it said, the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth. And the earth, it says, was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of it. In other words, it's chaos.
Ihaya leitu limle mer nei lowina avwak kin oma chi changa chama. Ichina mumal nei lo taka azia omlo ma bang set form hian nei lowina om chi nai sok nei lo. Mer pok nei lowina ma hin.
And from there, he began the process of organizing it.
Hoi ke panina aman kha hoi takina hongbol takahi.
Bringing organization into a chaotic existence. Bringing, I'll just skip that. I've already made the point. Okay, so what I want us to see is that not only is this showing us God's great power, but it is showing His sovereignty, His rule over His creation.
Hoi pathena puchibanga thil abo thi nai na athili the na athupi na le thil teng teng tunga thunei tu hi na ala ke son so nai.
And what God has created by His power, He now maintains by His power, which also demonstrates His sovereignty.
Athili the na thupi taka abo kya pen ama thunei na nuai ma akoi the nai kha apakhian thupi na alang sakai.
In Job chapter 12, verse 10 is this statement. In fact, Job chapter 12.
Job bung som ni na kha kichina agena.
And particularly verse 10, I would like for us to read.
Job bung som ni Job chapter 12 verse 10. Job chapter 12 verse 10. Ama ko ta thil hing chiteng kha le ming teng teng ha na aum hi.
Isaiah 40 said that in God's hand He holds the universe.
Isaina akuta khovel alen hi khovel aum hi chia.
Job tells us that in God's hand is the life of every living thing.
Ha Jobina pathian ko ta kha kinna nei teng teng kha le pathian ko ta uma chi hi.
God rules His universe.
Pathian na leyawan avai ho ma hi.
Now, there are a lot of people who are persuaded that there is a God.
Mitam pite kha pathian oma hi china ama le mau ka ke so wa.
But they also are persuaded that God is indifferent. He just doesn't really care about His creation.
Ile hu che bang mi khen khat te mai na pathian ben bang ma ngai sak lo hi ming te thil siam ten to ki sai khalo hi chinon je lo hi.
So He created it and He put into motion the laws of nature.
Pathian khat ve en asiama aban chu ngai sak no lo veng re che po lo me.
But then He just stepped back and He now has nothing to do with it.
Pathian thil siam ki ti kama tol dam tai na ngai sak no lo wa ama tol dam den ta che po lo me.
Genesis makes clear that although God is indeed distinct from His creation, He nonetheless still is in control of His creation.
Pathian kha athil siam te to ki bang hilo ma athil siam te polam ong hina pi na athil siam te pen hoi taka man kha lunglu ta pen kai he chi thik no dingai.
From chaos, He brought order.
Ya mel kwak nei lo ke pa na mel kwak kilom tak ong bol kia hi.
And He continues to provide the direction for the universe to continue to function orderly.
Hu che na man kho ve na khil pai dan taka hoi taka apai thina dingina koi dan ke dia hongbo saklai
So not only is God powerful, but God is also totally sovereign over his universe.
pathian kha thupi na le loina akhil sam teng tunga thunei tu vai hom tu hi ki
Now there are two more characteristics in the Genesis account that I want us to go through rather quickly.
in the wina pathian hi na chini te game lai dinga
So number 4 is this, and that is that God is a just God as it is revealed to us in these first 3 chapters.
he apanina pathian dik tat ahi chikha imunom te
In Genesis chapter 3 is revealed the disobedience of humanity.
Genesis bung thum na kha ming te gilok na pen kha hong lak ka
And that resulted in the punishment of humanity as well as the entire creation, which we are still feeling to this day.
wai khat na je te na ming te go na le ele tu ma thil siam tengin hak sat na kun ta ne ma itwak to la he
And as you continue to read through the Genesis account, particularly the first 11 chapters, you begin to see the record of what has been referred to as primeval history.
Kaya bung kada kan bung som na khat tan ihung sim jang ina midang la khang thuma sa no khang thuma sa te primeval history chi kha
It is history that is only recorded in the biblical text. There is no extra biblical writings about what you see in the first 11 chapters of Genesis.
When to Genesis bung kada kan bung som na khat ha lai sang tholo lai budang ha ko ma bi get khalawa he lai sang thol kya ki mo he chi nai
There are 2 primary acts of judgment outside of the judgment of the creation itself in Genesis chapter 3.
the tree
Yeah, there are 2 other separate acts of judgment that are revealed.
Genesis bung thum na kha pathian thu khun hiam pathian thu khen na ni ati mo lai ding he
There is the global flood that is spoken of in Genesis chapter 6 through 8.
Genesis bung go ka pan bung ya te na le tung kum pi tu chin tun na thui mo
And then there is the Tower of Babel, in which all peoples were scattered, and languages, like what we're experiencing today, is now the reality.
ko chin am ba be den sang lam na mi teng teng khawel mun teng ki the da na le to nya pau tom izat ti na pen tha Genesis bung som na kha ja ka he
All acts of judgment,
pathian thu khen na teng kha
which is screaming at us that God is a God of justice.
pai te na bangai te na pathian dik tat ahi chi kha te la ngai
We live in a world that is a beautiful creation.
pai ja pathian ki siam hol tak sunga ko ve la yoma
It is a world that initially God declared to be very good in Genesis chapter 1 verse 31.
Genesis bung kha chang som kum le khat na pathian akhil siam te hol asama ama chi am pe na hiya
And yet we see a world that is struggling.
ai ha tu lai ko ve pen hak sama ama i mu hi
A world that is filled with natural disasters.
he china ni ko ve la to siam na khel tom te hui pi hu pi te om di ya
A world that is filled with the evils of humanity.
pawan ning te gi lo na tom te na kum dim to wa
Man's distrust for his fellow man, primarily because we don't understand each other's languages.
khala khat te ki mon mon lo na mo ilung sin ngai to na le pau la ham ki thik to lo na te ziat bang
And even our hatred for fellow man.
abana ilom i khan i mi hin pi te kwat na te bang
So what we see in the modern day, well, what we see ever since the Genesis account, is a world that is both good and evil.
wa je Genesis sa pane mo chu khovel ki chi kha tu nga ke pan kha khel na ke pan kha agilo khil hoi lo kha tun ta na pai to de nei
And if we are truly thinkers, we wonder, why is this?
khil ngai to tak tak le chu he te bang je ai dio chi te ki
But perhaps more importantly, we wonder, what is being done about it?
ai le hoi kha bang che bol ding yam chi kha he to a ngai to ding kha
And for people of faith, we are wondering, what will be done about it?
Hai ban ai kim to tia ding bang in so put chi hi tai chen ni na bang a ko hi ta ding
And what we see is something that reveals to us again the power of God,
wai don na ding na pathian thili khinang ke lak khyam non dan ni thei a ko mo a
and we see that God is going to right all of the wrongs that have invaded his creation.
เพราะฉะนั้นพระเจ้านะไว้อดีตเราแต่งโบดิขินอดีตพระเจ้านะหงเก็บสักหน่อย
And the reason he is going to do that is because he is just.
อาจารย์ข้าพระเจ้าดิกตัดอะไรอีกอย่างนี้
And as the Revelation teaches us in Revelation chapter 21,
ถ้ากีฬาในบุญส้มนี่แหละครับที่น่าห้องเดียนะ
we will eventually take our place as believers in God's new creation.
ถ้าพระเจ้าเชื่อเสียงทักไปมุ่งหน้าพระอำนวยยังให้บ้านทักอะไรทักเป็นเนาะ
And we will be dwelling in a place that is once again very good.
ไปพระอำนวยอามาพระอำนวยยังให้เจ๊ให้
And so finally, that leads us to the fifth attribute that we see revealed about God in Genesis chapters 1 through 3.
จันทิสบุญข้าราชการบุญทุนกาเลนะแต่ข้าตัวนะพระเจ้าหินาอ่างานเย็นดีนะ
And what we see is a God of grace.
พระข้าเฮปิตูพระเทียนเป็นหมดอย่างให้
Having come to see the just nature of God who created everything, we also see that God is gracious to the people who cause the problems in the creation problem itself.
พระเจ้าดิกตัดนาทูเรียนขึ้นตาตัวนะพระเจ้าดิกตัดนาตกิจอมินาพระเจ้าเฮปินาลำดังๆเลยอิมุสุปะมาดึงให้
Adam and Eve sinned, which is resulted in the terrible things we are still experiencing today.
อาดัมเลยวิขาอนาเคียลขาวะตัวนี้นั่งเลยเกลี่ยอิเชลเทนาที่ไม่นามาเลยอนาเคียลละ
But God demonstrated His graciousness by pointing out a promise. The promise of one who will come, who will fix everything.
เนี่ยพระเจ้านะไว้เขียนนาแค่ปันสวดตักเขียนอะไรกันนะทุเจียมถัดเนาะทุเจียมถัด
That's found in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15.
พระเจ้าจะนิสัยของผมจันส้มในงานนาคิดหมู่นี้
And it is talking about the seed of the woman who will come and bruise the head of the serpent that led humanity into the sin.
ไว้ทุจูนุ่มอีส่วนนะไว้บุลส่วนเป็นอาเกตอลุตังสุดุสักดิ่งสิ่งนักตัวพันในอิมัวนี้
And so God, from the very beginning, established a plan. Even before the beginning, Peter tells us, a plan to restore His creation.
พระเจ้าพิจารณาให้กันเกี่ยงบางค่ะเสียงตุ้งอาเกปันในนับพัฒนาอเลมเกี่ยวซาค่ะมอทิวเต็งตังโบลิกินั่นเองค่ะแปลงค่ะโบลซาใหม่
And when the world became so corrupt that God determined to destroy it in the global flood that we understand was the flood in Noah's day,
พอเวลมาซาเป็นยิดเราหน้าอ้วนหัวเจ๊กันนะพัฒนาปีชีวินะอานาสุเสตาอันหุ่นไหนนะ
there was hope for the future as God demonstrated His grace to Noah and his family.
ที่มาเลยพัฒนาโนวาเลยไอ้คนที่เป็นนะคะทุเจียมค่ะนอกจากละเม็ดหนาก็ตะกุยสักเว
And when the world had once again become corrupt to the point that God dispersed them throughout the earth at the Tower of Babel,
พอเจ้าเขาเวลายิดเราหน้าอ้วนมาอามาอนอนตากเสียเสียกันนะไว้บะเบลินสังลำนาที่พัฒนาพัฒนามีเต็งค่ะเขาเวลมุนจากพัฒนาห้องดักจากนอนตาย
Genesis chapter 12 begins the rest of the story where God, through Abraham and his seed, is going to fix the problems of humanity again, demonstrated by God's grace.
พุทธินาเจเนซิสบงส้มนี่อาปันไปไว้พักยันต่างต้นที่เราตุกเสพส่วนในทูเงินเอาเงินตาไว้ค่ะพักเทเลนาไว้อับราฮัมจิส่วนนักที่พัฒนาอาเฮปีนาห้องหลักยักษ์นาทูเตพะวาสิงคโปร์ตเป็นห้องเงินตาเฮ
I like to read. I'm sure you men like to read too. I hope you do at least.
เนี่ยBibleส่งไปลงดูตัวต้องสิ่งสักเล่นกัจเจ
And when I read a book, I want the first chapter to grab my attention.
ลายบุกสิ่งเจงินะจับใจมาสเปนข้ากันลงดูมาสัก
If it doesn't, sometimes I still try to wade through the book, but it's not near as interesting as if that first chapter's finally got my attention.
เพราะฉะนั้นผมขันนักสิ่งเจงินะอาบานเตะเจนักอาบานจวลเลขาอาบุลดันดุตุกาคักปันดุจงนนสเกฮี
It's in that first part of the book that the characters are introduced to us.
อาจารย์ข้าอาบุบุลขับนับเป็นนะคะอารมณ์รุดไว้เรื่องรุดไว้เราคัดพิเศษ
They are developed right from the start of the story.
like atang thu ki pat na ke pan ahot anok anok ke thei pa he.
Now, the Bible is a book that is filled with all kinds of characters, none of whom, by the way, are fictitious.
Hela san tho tang thu tam pio ma wai tang thu ki yen te ka phwa tom yam ai cha tang thu mai mai ki chen chen lo atak tak ngai.
All of them are important.
Poi mo pe na hi le.
But who do you think the most important character is in the Bible?
Ta sang tho phwa tang thu poi mo pen pen din ngai to la le.
It is God. God is the most important character in the Bible.
La sang tho poi mo pen pen so pa thian na hi.
And where is God introduced to us?
Pa thian kha ko ya ang ki yen masa le.
Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. That's right. Okay, so as you begin the process of starting to read the Bible, quickly you have revealed to you the greatest character that is unfolding in this book.
Hoi ja ka la sang tho kha abu la pa ni sim jangina. La sang tho kum kia ki yen di pa tang thu pe ka mo. Abu le na imu pa.
From the first 3 chapters, we see a God who is powerful beyond our imagination.
Ya bung thum ta ni na masai na pa thian jingai to na ke lam pe ka thili thei pa thian ine ya.
A God who transcends his creation.
Parwana akhil siam te polama om khatoma.
A God who is sovereign over his creation.
Akhil siam teng teng tunga thunei tu pa thian ine ya.
A God who is just.
Pa thian adik dik tat pa thian khat ine ya.
And a God who is full of grace.
Parwan happy na dim pa thian ine ya.
And that from the first three chapters.
Wai he jenis bung khat apan bung thum sunga imu.
But as these chapters reveal to us all of this information about God, it also reveals information to us about ourselves.
Wai na pa thian hi na pa ke sai honggen ka kita na hi na poi hiam si de hon lakai.
But let me say this as I conclude.
Akasok din he honggen dinga.
We will never understand ourselves until we understand God.
Ei ki thei siam ngai lo din pa thian hi na di ka thei siam na.
I'm done.
Ka lo ta he.